Thanks, Thomas. We will now have Darby Ryden presenting her talk on the connection between ubiquity and the society.
Sorry. Leg warmers, crazy colors, shoulder pads. Grunge, Y2K, khakis. Facebook, selfies, and Uggs. 80s, 90s, 2000s. But you can all tell, right? All of these things are ubiquitous in the decades that they appeared in. And these ubiquitous symbols and cornerstones can tell us more in regards to ourselves than we think. Ubiquity is the state of being everywhere all at once. So, obviously something that's everywhere all the time can be used to evaluate the beings that set up the events that allowed that item, trend, or idea to be in its ubiquitous state. For example, the rising popularity of selfies can be attributed to the rising popularity of camera-enabled cell phones, therefore giving more people the ability to take selfies. And over time, these ubiquitous symbols can be used to show the viewpoints, opinions, and even economic welfare of a certain time period or place, and can even give us a sense of depth into the goings-on of the human mind. Because what better for the purpose of teaching us about ourselves than the things that we've created? So, back to the 80s. Everything that has a sudden rise in popularity has a trigger. A simpler occurrence of this would be in 1982 when there was a sudden rise in sales of Reese's Pieces. This can be attributed to their appearance in the 1982 movie E.T. earlier that year. Other things rising to popularity in the 80s include Strawberry Shortcake, Fraggle Rock, Care Bears, Super Mario Bros., plastic charm necklaces, and jelly shoes and bracelets. What do all of these incredibly different things have in common? They're all incredibly colorful. And what else was recently reaching its peak in popularity? Color television. All-electronic color television was introduced to the US in 1953, and by 1977, 75% of all television owners in the US owned a color television. Along with this sudden ability to see color, it spread not only through television, but also to children's toys, jewelry, and, let's be honest here, what was not totally, if not unnecessarily, extremely colorful in the 80s. But now let's get into something deeper than color. As can be seen through the aforementioned wild colors, wacky wardrobe, and funky music, the 80s was about letting go, because people realized that they could. No more ankle-length skirts, long pants in the summer, classical music. People finally realized that that wasn't the only way they could enjoy life. A National Geographic article on a documentary about the 80s states on the decade, it isn't about nostalgia. It's about the modern history that spawned political, technological, cultural, and social revolutions that began in the US and went on to dominate the world. And while we may have toned it down since the 80s, we definitely haven't slowed down. After the 80s, you could say that the 90s functioned as a mellowing stage, by comparison at least, for the technological evolution of the 2000s. Cell phones are thoroughly dispersed, as are computers, and technology is really starting to take hold. As for fashion, the mainstream is an overall preppy style, but also begins grunge. I can see some of you cringing, and don't worry, it was just a phase. Alternative music, and I do what I want attitude, and a style that says, I don't care, so I won't try. This movement began in the 80s with the appearance of punk, but became much more prominent in the 90s as more variations were created. But we're not here just to talk about what, let's talk about why. In the 90s, we're living in a world that's reinventing itself. Cell phones, computers, medical technology, and more. And in this world, being innovative is how to get by. You make money by thinking of the next big thing before some other guy invents it and becomes the next Graham Bell. The point is, we've created a world where different is the expectation, and teenagers, well, there isn't a lot for them to do. But what they can do is conform to everyone's deep-seated and sometimes unhealthy need to belong, but obviously in the most rebellious way possible. They can't create something different, so they become different themselves. The grunge and punk of the past can easily be compared with the hipsters that we all know and mock today. And moving on, a pivotal event in the 90s. The terrifying, the mysterious, the disastrous event in which nothing went wrong, Y2K. Y2K was the fear that at the change of the millennium, the switching to 2000 in 6-digit dates would cause problems in date mathematics and systems that check valid dates, such as credit card processing. Long story short, everyone thought that New Year's would make all of the computers crash, and the government would collapse, and fire would rain from the sky, and hedgehogs would become the dominant species on Earth. But it sounds kind of silly when we word it like that, doesn't it? Because the truth is, it kind of was. It was all a very big what-if scenario, sped much more by public fear than by official statements of legitimate research and facts. Honestly, we were like a paranoid child with a new toy. Now that we finally had something, we realized just how easily it could be taken away. And while Y2K was a false alarm, this may not be such a bad mindset for some of us to keep. Now that we've analyzed the past, let's analyze the present. And at this point, we must ask ourselves, what's scarier? A blast from the past on how we were then, or some insight on how we live our lives right now? One thing that's much more apparent today is the effect that Ubiquity has on us. And this can be seen through our sudden and extensive ability to view statistics, whether it's what coffee you order every morning, a Venti 7-pump vanilla non-fat extra hot caramel swirl latte with whipped cream, or the amount of times you visit YouTube every day, which is honestly way too many times for you to actually be considered productive. One thing that there's certainly much more of is brands. Because as more things are invented, we can actually make money off of them, instead of, let's say, trading a basket you made for a dozen eggs from your neighbor. This is why patents were created. The unfortunate thing for inventors is that if they are successful, their invention can become so ubiquitous and so integrated into society that it can become a generic term, such as Advil instead of ibuprofen, bubble wrap instead of inflated cushioning, and zippers instead of class blockers. The ubiquity of these items is what allowed them to become generic. Like, imagine a world where only one company makes Advil, another for zippers, one more for cell phones. Not only would this not create enough supply to meet demand, but would also greatly restrict the amount of innovation allowed for the product due to lack of access to it. Us being aware of ubiquity in the world today is vital to the economy running efficiently. And without turning this speech totally to social media, it would be impossible to analyze the human race as a whole without taking into account the recent boom in social media and networking and the effect that it's had on us. A study at Harvard University found that one of the reasons why social media is so popular is because we as humans feel compelled to share everything about ourselves and our lives. An article on the study states, the researchers at Harvard University learned through the study that the act of disclosing information activates the same part of the brain that is associated with pleasure. And as more and more methods of disclosing information are created, and these methods become easier and easier to access, the internet is becoming an even more integral part of the world today. Because almost anything, and I mean anything, and everything can be found on the internet. How many inches in a mile? 63,360. When's this television program you want to watch? Next week on Wednesday at 8, Eastern Standard Time. What's the name of that one song that starts dun 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 dun? Eye of the Tiger by Survivor. How do you retrieve the Google document containing the 10-minute long speech that you spent weeks writing when it disappears before you have to rewrite it? Well, we couldn't exactly find that. But the point is, if we can suddenly find anything at the tips of our fingers, what will we do when we can't? Will we no longer be able to do anything for ourselves? Imagine if the internet collapsed right now. No email, no YouTube, no Facebook, no Instagram. Crazy, I know. I remember during Hurricane Sandy, if there was one thing that I would thank my lucky stars for, it would only take me a few seconds to figure out what it would be. Sure, my family had a generator, we had a gas stove so we could boil the contaminated water, and my house hadn't collapsed or been flooded. But most of all, while the power had been knocked out, the internet sure hadn't. And you can bet I spent that entire week watching Netflix. But it's scary to think about. I wasn't grateful that I still had a roof above my head. I was just glad that I could still surf the web with the abundant amount of free time that I had just been provided. As more and more necessities become ubiquitous, we need to be wary of how much we rely on them, because they may not always be there. As much as we as humans have evolved since the 1980s, morally, mentally, and technologically, our fundamentalities really aren't that far apart. We want to see more color because we can. We want to take pictures of ourselves, and we will because we can. You couldn't just have one person control 7 billion, because if we didn't want it to work, and we struggled enough, it wouldn't. And these factors that affect into our lives are more than we think, but we affect these factors more than we could possibly imagine. We often believe that we don't matter, because if we don't show up, 100 others will. But if we continue this mindset, we will become apathetic and lethargic and belong to the first big name who realizes that they can control us. The things that affect us and factor into our lives are ubiquitous, but guess what? So are we. Thank you.